Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, have we got an exciting show for you tonight. We've managed to wrangle up 4 guest stars from the new FNAF era, ranging from a variety of the newest content released in the FNAF franchise. We've got a good show for you tonight. Oh, here they come now. Why don't we introduce them to all of you? First up, we have a blast from the past. It's the time-traveling ball pit. Next up, we have the member that holds everything together. It's Fazgoo. Next up, we have the member that borders on the edge of insanity. It's the reality warping mask. And last but certainly not least, we have the newest member to this group. We have a game that has nothing to do with Five Nights at Freddy's. Let's give a round of applause to our guest stars. Wow, look at the time. We don't want to waste any more time. Let's just jump right on into the show. How's it going, everybody, and welcome back to another Discussions video. Now, as you could clearly tell, today's video is going to be talking about the problems and issues that I have with newer FNAF. And while this is still going to be an objective video, it is more so my opinion and my, I guess, how I see these objective things about newer FNAF. So it is still a very personal, I guess, discussion, you could say, but I do want to look at the bigger picture as well. And in this video, I do want to do a little bit of breaking down of different aspects of newer FNAF. So I want to talk about the books, I want to talk about the newer games, and then we'll have a specific section dedicated to what we know about Secret of the Mimic, because there's a lot to talk about there. So that's going to be how the video is broken down. But before we really get into talking about all this stuff, I do want to set some guidelines, define a few things about what I'm going to be talking about in the video. And so that's what we'll start off with here first. But before we actually get into it, go down and leave a like and subscribe while you're down there, because this is my passion. This is what I like to do. And if you guys go and do that, I can continue to do what I enjoy most, and we can continue to make content here on YouTube. So I would really appreciate it if you guys did that. And enough with that. Let's just get right into the video, and I'll start with defining exactly what I'm going to be talking about in this video. So to cover a few bases first, I guess you could say, by books, I want to talk about Tales from the Pizzaplex and Fazbear Frights. I'm not going to go into Silver Eyes trilogy. I'm not going to get into any of the other books like the Survival Logbook or any of like the accompanying, is that the word, books towards FNAF. I'm just talking about the sort of main newer series of story books, I guess you could say. So those are the main books I'm going to be talking about. Games, I'm only talking about Help Wanted, Security Breach, Ruin, and Help Wanted 2, as well as Secret of the Mimic, but again, that's its own section. But out of the main newer games, those are the 4. I'm not going to talk about any tie-ins like those Security Breach tie-ins like Fury's Road or anything like that. Like, I'm clearly not going to talk about that. And I'm not going to talk about Into the Pit because it's not a mainline FNAF game. It's just a like supporting side story FNAF game, so it doesn't really impact what I want to talk about in this video. So not talking about Into the Pit, but I am talking about the main 4 newer FNAF games. I think it's just the 4, I think, but I'm just going to be talking about those. So that's my guideline there. And then with Secret of the Mimic, obviously I can really only talk about the trailer and some other info that we have about it, but I'll still be sharing my opinion. It'll sort of be like my analysis of the game that we know about so far, but I think it is pretty fitting with the topic of this video because it has stirred the pot quite a bit in what exactly is Five Nights at Freddy's. So there's my kind of quick guideline definition stuff about what we're going to be talking about. And with that, let's just jump right on into the books, because this is where the content really starts, and this is where I think FNAF began to become not FNAF. So just to get it out of the way first, I have not read any of these books, mostly because I do not own any copies of these books, although I have thought about buying them just so that I can say that I've read them, except I also don't know about the idea of sitting and reading over a dozen books worth of FNAF stories that are just wild and outlandish. That sounds like I might lose my mind. I might actually turn into MatPat if I do that, so that's a question we'll think about. But anyway, the books, I think, are really the catalyst into why FNAF is the way it is today, in terms of the fact of basically anything goes in the games. But we'll get to that in a minute. But what I mean by anything goes is the fact that the books introduced countless strange, wacky, some might even say crazy ideas that make no sense in any context to any story. It doesn't even have to be FNAF. It makes no sense anywhere, but yet they're introduced as FNAF concepts. And just to name a few examples of what I'm talking about, first of all, time traveling ball pits. Also, talking about 15-foot tall trash rabbits. Faz goo, those little Bonnie swimmer thingies, and a shark, just to name a few things. I know there's countless other crazy and wacky topics, but those are just a few that I felt like sharing, mostly because those are the only ones that I really know. So, but even just talking about those ideas just shows how crazy the books are compared to everything else in Five Nights at Freddy's. It really does set the precedent of any idea you have, anything, any concept of any wild idea. Could be anything. Aliens. Who knows? Maybe they'll show up in FNAF. Like, it sets the precedent that any idea can be a FNAF story if you set it in a certain context. And it doesn't even have to be a FNAF story. You can just slap the FNAF IP on there and call it a FNAF story, and it might not have anything to do with FNAF. And for that one, I know Bunny Call, I'm fairly certain, doesn't have like anything to do with Five Nights at Freddy's. Like, it's a dude in an orange bunny suit that tries to break into these people's cabins, and then it turns out like he wasn't actually hired to do it. Nobody knows who the heck that guy was. The guy who was supposed to be there didn't show up, so it's like, who's this mysterious bunny character in the costume? Except, like, it doesn't have anything to do with Five Nights at Freddy's. So why is it here? Right? And I think that's my biggest thing with a lot of these books, is that they have ideas that could be interesting on their own, but it really seems like they just slapped the FNAF IP on there just to give it some sort of backing so that people will buy them. But the stories really don't have anything to do with Five Nights at Freddy's, like, at all. And some of them do. I honestly think Into the Pit isn't a bad story, despite the fact of it having a time-traveling ball pit. I think it's actually not that bad. It seems like a pretty fun story. The game, I said I wasn't going to talk about the game, but the game was fun. But I think even that concept, it's weird, it's wacky, and it's good service for like a book or a fun game. But if they introduce that into like the main FNAF games, then that'd be too much. And while they haven't brought over too many ideas from the books to the games, aside from like the mimic, but we'll get into that later, I think just the core idea of anything goes sets a dangerous precedent to the games that can turn them from a simple indie horror series to generic mascot horror because of how crazy the ideas are. And so we'll kind of move on to the game since I bring them up quite a bit here, and that's obviously the main focus, and that's really where I know more of my information, because I'm not a books guy, I'm a games guy. So we'll move on to the games, but I just felt it was fair to bring up my idea on why I think the books are the catalyst to where the games are today. So moving on to the games, there are actually a few positive things that I want to bring up with them first, mostly the earlier ones. So I honestly think Help Wanted is one of the best FNAF games of all time, because it still feels like a FNAF game, but in a newer setting, and it's VR, which is super fun. But Help Wanted really still encompasses the FNAF idea of a game while changing up the gameplay, which I think the gameplay itself doesn't define a FNAF game. I think how it works does. So Help Wanted has a ton of different mini games. Some of them are previous FNAF games, but some of them are new, right? And I think the combination of simple yet complex at the same time kind of gameplay that FNAF is usually known for, mixed with a story that isn't thrown in your face, is what makes Help Wanted such a good FNAF game, because that's how FNAF games tend to work. Even Sister Location, while throwing a story in your face, still feels like a subtle story. It's probably out of the original 6, the most story heavy game, but even then, Sister Location isn't too crazy outlandish compared to what we have now. But I think what makes a FNAF game is that simple but also kind of hard gameplay, and a simple but also more complex story if you're looking for it. And that's what Help Wanted has. If you just played the whole game without collecting any tapes or anything, you'd play the game, you finish the game, that's about it. But if you collected the tapes and you looked for lore, then you'd find more secrets to a larger story, and thus becomes the more complex story that FNAF games can tend to have. And so that's why I think Help Wanted is such a good FNAF game. But things start to change a little bit when you get to Security Breach. Now, I'm a Security Breach fan. I'm like one of the only people out there who has Security Breach in their top 3 favorite FNAF games of all time. I love Security Breach. A lot of people hate it. I don't know why. I think a lot of people just hate it because of the bugs. Honestly, I think that's why. I feel like most people just hate it because of the buggy launch that it had. But I think Security Breach is the last, at least mostly good FNAF game that got released. And not in terms of like, oh, it's a great game, but in terms of it feels like a FNAF game. Because it has a story, but the story can become more complex as you look for more lore, right? Like a FNAF game has. If you're looking for it, your story becomes more complex. You can get different, more complex endings, stuff like that. But if you just play the base game, you go through, you get the little bit of a story, the game ends, and that's about it. So it can work for different types of people, or even different types of fans of Five Nights at Freddy's. And I think that's what really defines a FNAF game. It's not the gameplay, it's how it works. And while Security Breach does change up the gameplay to a free roam style game rather than what FNAF has been before, I still think it offers the same core concept in terms of having some more simple gameplay that can be complex at times, mixed with that simple but also complex story that I think FNAF has. And so that's why I like Security Breach. I get why people don't. I even get why people don't, even if it's not about the bugs. But I still think it's a very decent FNAF game. But we really lose that with Ruin. As much as I like Ruin, I think it was a really great game. I think they really did a great job of turning the Pizzaplex into a scary environment. I think it was too story heavy, because it was such a point A to point B narrative story that FNAF tends to not have, in terms of like such a solid in-your-face story, that it doesn't quite feel like a FNAF game. Now, there's another element about why I don't like this as much, but we'll get to that in a second. But I think the main thing for me is the story. It just doesn't feel like FNAF because there's you just work your way through a story. There's not like differences that you can go through. I mean, even Security Breach has like a different order you can do things. Like, you don't have to dismantle a certain animatronic in a certain order, right? There is some level of variance in Security Breach, whereas Ruin has a if you played it again and again and again, it would be the same exact thing every time. Maybe you would get jump scared at a slightly different location than you did before, but its replayability factor is non-existent. You don't replay Ruin unless you're like going in to look for every itty bitty little detail, but you don't replay like I would replay Security Breach anytime. I'd be like, it's so fun, I'll go replay it, try something different, work on something different, right? Like, I'll replay Security Breach or Help Wanted or any of the previous FNAF games. I will never replay Ruin because there's no need. I played it once, I won't play it again. I guess I did kind of lie. I'll never play Sister Location again either for the same reason. But I think this idea of a central narrative story that carries the whole game ultimately denies it from being a FNAF game, because it removes what makes FNAF FNAF by getting rid of the replayability factor and by getting rid of the subtle story that you can find more complex things about if you look for it. Now, the other thing I don't like about Ruin is the Vanny mask. And this is where I think the book's influence comes into play. I think their influence also comes in with like the stories and stuff, but not as big of a deal. I think the wacky ideas from the books is why we got the Vanny mask. Now, the Vanny mask isn't in the books, but it's such a wild concept of you putting on a mask that you can phase through reality that it fits perfectly in the books. And because people like MatPat and these top theorist people have read all the books, they're now accustomed to that being FNAF. So nobody gets surprised by, oh, a Vanny mask that allows you to phase through reality. You just go, oh, well, that's just Five Nights at Freddy's. Another crazy concept added to the games. But we didn't get any of that in Help Wanted or Security Breach. Like, we got some different concepts, but no, like, phasing through reality. That's a big thing I didn't like about Ruin. It makes zero sense. If you look at it from any logical standpoint, despite the fact that it's 2030, it makes zero sense how you can have a mask that you put on and you phase through reality. That doesn't make any sense. But people just go with it because that's how crazy FNAF is these days. You just roll with it. It can be the most outlandish idea, but who cares? It's just Five Nights at Freddy's. And I think that's ultimately what is ruining the franchise. Is just these crazy ideas. We need to snap back to reality, as a famous rapper would once say. So we need to just go back to what made FNAF FNAF. And that doesn't mean gameplay. That just means simple yet effective story and simple yet effective gameplay. Now, moving on to the last game in this section, Help Wanted 2, is almost the exact opposite of Ruin, because there is no story. There's basically no story in Help Wanted 2. The story is that we become Maskbot, or that Glitchtrap maybe dies. But we only get that from the ending cutscenes. Nothing in the game actually helps us with that. There's no subtle story that gets brought up throughout the game, and then we get it revealed at the end. We only get the story in the ending cutscenes. So you could play the whole game and not play a single ending and have utterly no story with the game whatsoever. Now, I'm not sure what really happened with Help Wanted 2 in terms of the story, because it feels like a lot got cut and it almost feels rushed in terms of trying to get it out, and that's why there's no story. But that's definitely the biggest thing for me. Ruin didn't feel like FNAF because there was too much story. Help Wanted 2 doesn't feel like FNAF because there's no story. It just feels like a hodgepodge of minigames that they felt like throwing together. It really probably would have served better as like a DLC than it would have its own game. So, not much else to talk about with Help Wanted 2 because there's not any crazy radical ideas brought up in that game, because there's almost nothing brought up in that game, but I had to mention it since it's on this list. But to sort of sum up this section, since there's a lot of like rambly talk here, to sum up this section, I think that as the games went on, more and more radical ideas got introduced into the games because of the crazy ideas brought up in the books. And now that anything goes, well, if it's in the books, then it's an idea that can be brought up in the games. Anything can get brought up in the games. Any wacky, crazy idea you have can now exist in the FNAF universe. And you just see that as the games go on. And especially as we get to our final game in our final section of the video, Secret of the Mimic. Oh boy, there's a lot to talk about with this one. Alright, so Secret of the Mimic. I'm going to keep this really brief because I've recorded this section honestly countless times and they've all been really long. So I'm going to keep this really brief, and I want to save most of actually specifically talking about Secret of the Mimic for a separate video, probably next week, as a quick take video. But I still felt like there's a few points that the game makes me think about that pertain to this video. So the main one is the lack of, I guess you could say, FNAF in the game itself, which then turns it into a more generic mascot horror game, which then kind of leads into my point of where FNAF games are headed. So very blatantly, very obviously, the game has very little connecting it to Five Nights at Freddy's in terms of anything iconic. Like, Freddy's not even there. Fredbear's barely visible on a poster. Fazbear Entertainment shows up as words on the side of a van, and you have Hand Unit. That's about it. Not much else. And it's more divisive. Some people really like it, some people really don't. I'm kind of on the camp where I think the game will be fun, but I don't really like what I'm seeing with the game. It doesn't really look Five Nights at Freddy's to me at all. It'll be fun, but I just am not liking what I am seeing with it. And I think the biggest thing for me is that it just looks like generic mascot horror. A lot of people have compared to Poppy Playtime. I am also one of those people. I've not made a post on it or anything. I've thought about it, but I haven't. But I do very much agree it looks like Poppy Playtime, and that's not necessarily bad, but it doesn't mean that it's a good thing for FNAF, because Five Nights at Freddy's has always had its own feel. Even something like Security Breach, while being drastically different in terms of gameplay for Five Nights at Freddy's, still fell within line of a Five Nights at Freddy's game. It didn't just feel like a generic it's a walking simulator. I'm not gonna pretend I'm saying anything profound here, but it still feels distinctively FNAF compared to other free roam games. So I think even then Security Breach was able to do something good there. But just looking at this trailer, I honestly don't get much uniqueness out of this. Like, nothing feels uniquely Five Nights at Freddy's. I mean, we can look down the character roster. Jackie, honestly, I think is probably going to be the best thing from the game. Jackie seems the most Five Nights at Freddy's-esque. She feels very sister location prototypey, which seems like that's kind of what they're going to be going for with a lot of the designs in this game. And I don't necessarily hate that. I think that would be really good if we got some sort of proto sister location designs. If they can tie in the sister location, that will make me happy. But aside from Jackie, I honestly am not a fan of much else in terms of designs. They all feel very generic to me, which is just going to show where Five Nights at Freddy's is headed. Now I'll save a big analysis for the next video, but I think the biggest thing for me is just that the feel doesn't feel Five Nights at Freddy's. It's just not there. I mean, heck, you have a stinking character from Kingdom Hearts show up. Why is there a Heartless from Kingdom Hearts here? Why is he here? It just feels like they're making random stuff up just to have in a game. And that's not very Five Nights at Freddy's. Why not have, I don't know, like, instead of having a weird looking mushroom dude, have a Bonnie animatronic, or have a Chico, or heck, even have like a frog, or Mr. Hippo. Like, have another character that we've seen a version of in the past. And there's some, I guess, potential connection with the elephant costume and the weird elephant dude from the Mediocre Melodies, but I think, like, even give some connection. Like, I get that it's Edwin Murray's factory, so he's not going to have direct FNAF characters, but then maybe make that where the mediocre melodies come from, right? Because we don't really know who made them. We're thinking Henry, but maybe Edwin made them. Like, that could have been cool. We could have gotten a cool tie-in there. Then you don't have to use Freddy, but you also have characters that are at least somewhat recognizable to the fan base, right? So instead of having, like, Mushroom Dude, which I honestly hate that guy. I hate him with a burning passion. That Mushroom Dude, everybody loves him. I hate him. He sucks. Maybe it's because I think he looks like a Heartless, and those guys are the enemy. I don't know. I just don't like him. But he really should have been a different character. And I think that's the biggest thing for me. There could have been a lot of cool ways to tie in random characters that we haven't had a good connection with in the past, like the mediocre melodies, right? Give some connection there. But we don't get any of that. Instead, we get new random characters created that make no sense. And I think that that's their goal of looking more generic mascot horror than they want to look Five Nights at Freddy's. Like, I think the goal for Secret of the Mimic and Steelwool making it was to make less of a FNAF game and make more of a wide appeal mascot horror game. And I honestly think it's... I don't want to sound rude. I really don't want to sound rude because I do like the game Steelwool make. But it does feel very... almost disgraceful, I guess you could say, or shameful, that instead of making a distinctive Five Nights at Freddy's game, they're making a generic mascot horror game. And they've had all the tools to make a good Five Nights at Freddy's game. I mean, like I said previously in this video, they made Help Wanted and they made Security Breach. Those are two of my favorite FNAF games of all time. They're both in my top 3 of all time. I mean, FNAF 4 beats them out, but the fact that 2 of the Steel Wolves games have made it into my top 3 favorite FNAF games goes to show that they can make good Five Nights at Freddy's games. And this just isn't it. I feel like this just kind of falls flat in a lot of different ways and just doesn't feel like Five Nights at Freddy's. And if this is where the series continues to go, I honestly think it doesn't have much time left. If they, like, when the Secret of the Mimic releases and then we hear rumors about the next game and they, like, announce it in, like, a year from now, or, like later in the year around like November or something like that, and it's like, oh, we get to see what the next game is gonna look like, and it's just another one of these. I don't know, like, I just think it would be done. The movies are gonna save FNAF, maybe the fan games will keep up the hype, but just where the games are headed, I mean, ranking Steel Wolves games that they've made so far, Help Wanted is the best, Security Breach is the second best, I would say Help Wanted 2 is the third best, and then Ruin is my least favorite out of all the ones that they've released, just in terms of how they feel. And if Secret of the Mimic is going to be anything like Ruin, which I feel like it will be, in terms of its linear storyline, I feel like it's going to then become my least favorite, because then Freddy just doesn't even freaking show up. There's no FNAF connection at all. And to kind of wrap things up with this, because I want to keep it brief, and we're already going on like almost 10 minutes here, to kind of keep things, you know, brief and summarize some things a little bit, I'm worried they're just making too generic of a game to stand out as a Five Nights at Freddy's game. I feel like a lot of people are going to forget it pretty quickly, unless there's memes, which I really hope they don't freaking do that. I might laugh if they have a part where it's like a audio log and he goes, "My name is Edwin and I made the mimic." I might laugh because it's kind of funny, but I would almost feel a little bit upset too. Maybe not upset. That's too strong. That's too strong of a word. I feel a bit cringed, I guess you could say. But I don't even know where I'm going with this. But I just think the game, I'm not gonna like it. I think I'm gonna like how it plays, hopefully, but I'm just not gonna enjoy it as a FNAF game. I think it's gonna get forgotten. Maybe a few memes pop up, and that's about it. But to kind of, you know, end things off here, I want to make this statement. Everybody quote this, write it down, so that I can come back to it later. I really hope that I'm wrong. Like, I hope everything I said bad about Secret of the Mimic is just wrong. I hope I'm just dead wrong, because I want this game to be the best FNAF game ever. I really do. I really want this game to just knock it out of the park as the best FNAF game ever made. I want that. And I hope I'm wrong with what I'm saying in terms of it being bad. But just based on what I'm seeing, I don't think it's going to get there. I think it's just going to go down as another dud. Probably alongside like Sister Location when that game first came out. So, I hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm going to be right. And I don't want to be right. So, anyway, I'm going to cut this section off here. We're going to move on into the summary where things will be more jokingly summarized. It's a bit more fun. It's supposed to be a bit more lighthearted, which will be nice, especially after this mostly serious section for the most part. The most serious I think I've ever been in one of these kind of videos. But the summary section, it'll be fun. Have voice acting from yours truly, and I hope you enjoy. And then after the summary, we'll do a little bit more talking about a couple points that I want you guys to hear about. So make sure to stay tuned for the outro as well. But hope you enjoy the summary, and I'll see you after that. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you enjoyed today's show. As we begin to wrap things up, we usually like to do some sort of a fun, I guess you could say, summary section here, just to kind of clarify a few things throughout the show, and to make sure everybody got the grand picture. So, in order of how things went, we talked about how we believe the books created this wild and nonsensical world of FNAF that we find ourselves in today, so they are the ultimate catalyst of most likely everything wrong with FNAF as it is these days. And we think that that kind of seeped into the games with things such as the reality warping mask in games like Ruin. And we also believe that it created the disaster that was Help Wanted 2 in its non-existent story. So, the books have kind of ruined the games. And I think nothing is more prevalent than Secret of the Mimic, where it takes no story elements from anything else except for the epilogues of Tales from the Pizzaplex, where we get to learn about the Mimic's origin, which could ultimately mean that this game is entirely useless. So, as the grand finale here, before we get into the actual finale, we've determined that FNAF, if it doesn't course correct anytime soon, might not be around as strong as it once was. We believe that a return to some level of previous normalcy, if you will create a strong FNAF game. And no, that does not mean making a game where you sit in an office and you close and open doors. We mean a simple yet effective gameplay style mixed with a simple but more explorative story. We hope that FNAF continues down that line, and we hope that you've enjoyed this show. And so now we will move on to the closing thoughts from our real narrator and not this show voice that I've thrown on here a little bit at night. I hope you guys enjoyed that summary. I hope it really kind of lifted the spirits. It was a bit of a downer mood there at the end, but all in all, I still love FNAF. I'll still play the games, but I'm just worried about where the franchise is headed. That's sort of the big, I guess, summary, if you will, of the video. So, anyway, we'll kind of wrap things up here. So, I'll have a poll over on my community tab about what topic you guys want me to do next for my next discussion video. So go check that poll out, go vote on that so that I know what I'm doing next. There'll maybe be a theory and some other different topics that you guys can vote on, so go do that. And yeah, we'll do Shameless Plugs. Go check them out. My Instagram and my channel membership are down below, so go check those out if you want to. And speaking of channel memberships, shout out to my channel members. Thank you for being my members, and here are your daily shout outs, because I do shout outs for all of my channel members. So if that is something that you want alongside some other perks, then you can become a member. Otherwise, not really that big of a deal. And yeah, if you guys want to say anything, like you want to say hi, or you have any other ideas for discussion videos that you want to leave down in the comments, then go do that, because I go through and read you guys' comments, so go leave one. And yeah, with that, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed and understood this video. And for your question of the day, what do you think about Five Nights at Freddy's, and where do you think it's headed? Do you think it's headed towards something good and that it can recover and come back as strong as ever? Or do you think it's going to continue to kind of go down and just not be as good as it once was? Leave that down in the comments if you made it this far in the video. And with that, I will see you in tonight's live stream. Goodbye.